Hello, welcome to another video. Today I want to talk about the usage of the Sidereal Zodiac within the classical text Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, and kind of put to rest, the idea that there's not any solid references, or we don't really know what they were using in these old texts. This came out of a conversation for somebody to, ask me to show them some proof that, Sidereal is being used within the ancient texts, and I'm going to give it here. And, largely because, Parashara, for many people, is kind of the Bible of Jyotisha as far as, is practiced today, as far as we understand it. Even if you don't think, it's the most foundational text, it definitely has, a huge variety of techniques not seen anywhere else. And, it's very important text nonetheless, no matter what you think. So, anyways, to get to the proof, and I'm going to try, we'll get into all sorts of things in this talk, so it'll be useful too. I'll give some historical background and just kind of different arguments and ideas. But basically, we see proof of Sidereal Zodiac when we look at the evaluation of strengths in the Spashta Bala chapter. And this is specifically for a strength called Ayana Bala, which is in slokas 15 through 17, if you want to look it up. And essentially, this Ayana Bala is based on the celestial equator and, the tropical placements of the planets in getting strength based on, basically seasonal influence of the time of birth. And, that's the basic idea. Now, the text clearly states in it, and this isn't really disputed, it's, there are some things that are disputed across different translations, and there's all sorts of mistakes and different things depending on which text you pick up, but it's pretty, agreed upon that the text states to add the ayanamsha for this specific strength calculation. So we're adding ayanamsha to the planets in order to get the position, the tropical position for this. So that means that the rest of the text was using sidereal placements. And when we get to this specific calculation where, we're going to calculate something based on tropical strength, we have to add the ayanamshas. You have to change the calculation in order to even know where that planet is within the scheme. So basically, if they were using Tropical Zodiac and Parashara, there wouldn't really be a need to do this. It would be redundant. So the fact that it's stating there is giving us a strong indication that, yes, Parashara was using the Sidereal Zodiac. Now, I mentioned other editions. I know in Sharma's edition, there's even an entire chapter on, how to erect a horoscope, and it's a similar thing in there too, where it says to add the ayanamsha, and that chapter's been debated whether it was part of the original and all that, and all sorts of stuff gets debated, that chapter is not seen in a lot of other editions, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But do know that there are more chapters in Parashara, and especially, there are some Sanskrit versions, and I think there's a Bengali version that has more chapters than is available in the English. And so there is more in Parashara than a lot of people even know in the Western world. So, without more scholarly work, without more understanding where Sharma was getting his text from, you can't really discredit that chapter either entirely. And I would be really interested if anybody has any information on that to share. The only thing I've heard is somebody tried to discredit it by saying it was a publishing ploy to get more money because, we got an extra chapter in our edition. And maybe, there's a lot of weird stuff in India going around that, but I do know people know the publishers, and, they would not do that, basically. So unless Sharma is being tricky, scholarly. I don't know. But either way, I don't want to get into that too much. So anyways, we clearly, in the text we do have for Parashara, we do see the support for the Sidereal Zodiac. Now, despite this, people want to choose to ignore it for, different reasons. And I want to look at some of those arguments just to shed some light on some alternative facts and some alternative views for why, you might not want to deny what's written in the text. And, we don't really have a basis unless you have a good sound basis for it. You need to ask yourself, like, well, am I going to, refute what that Parashara is using Sidereal when it's right there in the text? So some of these arguments that come up to throw questions, to throw doubt on Parashara is the idea that this is a corrupted text. Another main one is that, Indians lost knowledge of Sidereal, tropical. It was held in the Hellenistic world. They knew what they were doing. This is another main one. They say Parashara was arranged from fragments. It's a recent composition. There's dots thrown because, other texts do define a tropical zodiac using, the signs that we know. But then, there's confusion because there's using another, the sidereal, and they're mixing the two, and they don't know what's going on once again. And then the other idea is, astrology was imported to India, and Indians don't know what they're doing. I don't know. Either way. So I'm going to get into each of these points, but these are just, an introduction to all these different things that people just try to throw out there. And so just to note, I'm not a historian. I wouldn't call myself a proper, academic scholar per se. I do study a lot. I read a lot, and I'm just going to give some very practical, common sense ideas and background information for you to consider in light of all this other stuff that's getting thrown around the internet. And, and I would encourage you to find more solid proof. If you stop the video here, get more solid proof before you try to discredit what's the fact that Parashara is using Sidereal Zodiac. So looking a little closer at the first point is the idea that this is a corrupted text. And one of the main arguments around this is this concept that Parashara has Jaimini principles in it. Okay, so there's this, and this is probably very common. It's a very mainstream opinion and idea that Parashara and Jaimini were two completely different systems, and that some guy sometime somewhere decided to just copy this stuff in there. And there's different traditions on this. Some traditions do keep it stayed and hold a strong line in this, and some don't. And then there's everyone who just repeats different things. And so unless you have a tradition that you follow and are very solid in that, then you don't have too much basis to form an opinion on this. I think, you can make arguments, but if you actually look at the text and look at what's written in both of them, you see that Parashara covers more information on everything called Jaimini principles. He gives more rules, more writing, and granted, Jaimini is a sutra form, so it's going to be much more condensed. But if somebody did copy this in Parashara, then they must have been making up a lot of stuff and just splicing it in there in all sorts of places too. Because when we look, we see that there's a lot of Jaimini principles that are kind of working throughout all sorts of chapters in Parashara. One of the things I've noticed, for example, is like Argala is a big one and a very important technique. And you'll see it come up in like descriptions of yogas or like dasha effects, and if he doesn't flat out call it Argala, but based on the strength and the planets and how things are working, you can see it's directly referencing that idea and why it's giving the effects it's giving. And so whoever, according to these people who were copying these things into there, did a really nice job to really include it throughout the text. So it's kind of a shaky argument. Another thing too is that we see that Jaimini gives, more information than what Parashara is giving in certain aspects. So he oftentimes either, gives a certain clue that Parashara may not have covered, that, someone might have a question in, or, he takes those base teachings like Argila and, the Rudas, and he does all sorts of interesting stuff with them and clarifies their usage, especially with the death calculations. So, if you take, and this is another argument depending on tradition. Some people think that there was only 2 chapters of Jaimini. Some people think there's 8. The most standard version that's out there in general is like a 4-chapter version. And if you look at that, there's a lot of death calculations in Jaimini, which is really the hallmark of that text. So depending, who you're following, if you're not aware of all those death calculations in Jaimini, then you're not grounded in Jaimini, really. So it's a really important part of it. But you see him working with, a lot of those principles that he's pulling out of, that I would say are, pulled out of Parashara. And, so either way you slice it, though, even if you want to say they're separate, that's fine. But, you can use these things interchangeably, just like K.N. Rao does. He keeps them separate, but then he says, oh, well, you can use them as a composite technique, which is the same exact thing if you just read Parashara and then follow up the Jaimini. But nonetheless, with that said, there are some corruptions in the text, and you might if you're reading and following along the Sanskrit and some of the logic of some of the chapters, certain things do get a little muddled and fallen apart. But it's not to say that whole huge chunks and large teachings were just randomly inserted in there at the whim of some person. So. And also, some segments have been lost. We don't necessarily have the full range of text that may have been there originally. So I'm not saying this, is a perfect text, but, I just trying to open it up that there are different views on this topic as far as corruption. And essentially, you can say this about almost any text and try to question it. So I have yet to see any really solid scholarly work that's, absolutely proves that any of the above. Okay, so it's depends who you want to follow, and who you have faith in is kind of what it comes down to in a lot of different ways. So either way, it's a questionable argument. Now, the next one I want to look at is this concept that Parashara was arranged from fragments, and it's a recent text. And in order to understand this one, you just need to look at some basics of how these texts were written and how they work. And so basically, most of those manuscripts were not written and compiled in book form like we have today. So there wasn't just a bunch of pages somewhere where that's Parashara over there. Each of the chapters was actually written in little in segments. And one chapter was a big bundle of palm leaves. Another chapter was another bundle of palm leaves. And so, if you collected all the different chapters, you'd have a complete edition of Parashara. Okay, but these did get spread out, and I've heard some stories about how this happened, but essentially, texts in general, a lot of times they were written either for occasions or for somebody important, or for a library, or some there had to be some good reason to really write down a text, especially when there was oral lineages and people who just held this information within them. Writing wasn't very important, honestly. And so, if for some references where, maybe these were given as like gifts at a wedding, and then they spread to different corners of India, and then somebody tried to collect them back. But, this just gives you some idea of how the text is actually working. And so, the current version we do have is somebody tracking down all these different palm leaf bundles, basically, to reconstruct the text. And you can deduce some of the ordering by intertextual clues. So that's why at the beginning, ending of chapters, it's saying, oh, Maitreya, I've just, taught you on the calculation of longevity or whatever. What do you want to know next? So there's these references to what just came before in the text, and what's coming after. Oh, let me now tell you about this and this and this, and you'll see this as a basic trope here and other places. And so that gives us some idea of, what should be in there, how should it be ordered. Okay, so it's not just totally random, which, some of these arguments make people think or make people believe. The other key one too is that palm leaves decay. Okay, so these things were copied over time. They were not written in steel or stone. And so through that copying process, yes, perhaps it was updated with the language, the Sanskrit it was being used, and perhaps some things were inserted there. I can't completely deny that that's a possibility. But, this argument that, it's a modern form of Sanskrit doesn't completely place it within a modern context. We don't, because if we look at the philosophy within the text itself, especially the creation chapter, it's a form of Sankhya, but it's an old form of Sankhya. It's a theistic form of Sankhya seen in Pancharatra texts, which is an early form of Vaishnavism, which itself is very hard to date. And it seems like it was a tradition that kind of, it bridged the gap between like Vedas and Tantra. And so it's the similar philosophy seen in the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, it's Bhagavata philosophy. And so right there, that's and it's held consistently throughout the Parashara text too, where he's mentioning different remedies, different deities, all these different things coming up. So that's the worldview that he's really coming out of. Okay, and there's other arguments too where people say Parashara wrote Vishnu Purana, which we do know is quite older, and things of this nature. So, it's not likely a very current text, even if the Sanskrit is a little more current. And this other thing too is that writing was a Greek influence heavily. Like I said before, these were oral traditions. People didn't need to write this stuff down. And, even in Parashara, he's referencing much older traditions or former masters within it. So Parashara was not the only one it's not like he just popped out of him. So he's referencing this material is coming from somewhere else. These are just some reference points. And one of the key things to not get caught up in textuality so much is to realize that some of these ancients, and this will get into when we start looking at history a little more, likely had enormous memories that we can't even fathom. Okay, so they likely were able to do intense mathematical calculations in their head to memorize entire texts. We know this, we pretty much know this for a fact that this was how a lot of it was transmitted, and writing things down was really a devolution. Okay, it was not an improvement. Even though we like to think, yes, our books are improvement and now our computers are improvement, but really, especially with computers, being an educator myself, we're seeing a loss of mental capacity the further we get into technology and how information is given and disseminated. So, their brains were their computers back in the day. So yes, just because some of the history we have things written down does not mean that's where it's all coming from necessarily. Okay, that's a Western imposition on history heavily. And I'm not, claiming all this stuff's coming from India and all this stuff. Like I don't know where it all came from, and you can't prove either one, but you do have to take into context the oral versus written kind of reality as well when, for a larger backdrop. And getting into this a little more, this idea that the Indians lost, so this is where we start looking at history, where they lost knowledge of the sidereal tropical difference, which has no solid proof. we know that the ancient world was interacting all the time. Babylon butted right up against modern day Iran, which more or less the border of ancient India. Okay, and it's pretty accepted in historical circles that the Greeks didn't have astrology basically until Alexander the Great, so roughly 300 BC. All this knowledge started getting import into the Greek world, and then with them establishing Alexandria became this big trading post, and this is where there was a big flourishing of astrological knowledge, and there was this great interchange during that time as well as after. I mean, it may have died down some, but these regions are fairly close together, and it's not like they were just these isolated cultures that we like to put in nice neat little boxes, which most common laymen might think. But if you look at historical records and what was going on, there's a great amount of interchange. And so with trade and everything comes trade of ideas as well. And to say that they lost this knowledge is a little preposterous. No good reason for it. Another big thing too is that Babylon, Egypt, Indians, they defined stellar positions for their uses of zodiac and nakshatras, and especially if we do want to just stick to the written record, normally the Babylonians are given credit with developing the zodiac, and this is a big reason why we have the stars named after these zodiacs. That's what they were using. So at some point, yes, the Hellenistic Greek world kind of pinned the tropical to the Rashis, and created some confusion there, most likely. So, this idea that where this stuff even came from, recognized historically, was using sidereal, is just one more strong point to be using sidereal calculations for astrological knowledge. It was well recognized that, the Chaldeans were expert astrologers, by Alexander's army, by the Greeks at the time. The Greeks admitted, we don't know anything. If you want to divine the stars, talk to the Chaldeans. They know how to, draw up nativities and predict the future and the past, okay? So, right there is a very important thing to consider. And then, as far as this difference between the zodiacs, there's references, the Greek Hipparchus gets credit for recognizing this difference. However, we see that there's equinoxes in different nakshatras in old texts. There's Varaha Mahira references. Oh, yes, nowadays the equinox happens at this point, but back in the day it was different. So they had knowledge of this, okay? And back in the day, during the shift when the whole tropical sidereal thing got confused, and after, there's no solid reason to not to think that, unless you just want to make arguments to try and confuse people. it's or prove your point or fix yourself into whatever argument you're trying to make. Then there's really no sound reason to do that. Next one is, where did Horus Copy come from? And I've kind of been touching on this. I've already talked about how Greece didn't have this, astrology, Alexandria, so I've already gone into this. Now, one of the big things with the Indian tradition, where they like to discredit it a lot of times and give more credence to the Hellenistic tradition and trying to give some weightage to the tropical reality, is that they say, yes, okay, fine, the original stuff came from Babylon, and then the Greeks really developed it. They really, they really nailed it. And then what happened was there was this Greek text that went on a trade ship, and it went to India, and some Indian guy copied it into Sanskrit, and then that book, brought Horus Copy to India. So there's this argument, and it's based on this text called the Yavana Jataka, which was translated and interpreted by the scholar named David Pingree, who's a big name with all this stuff. So, those of you familiar with these topics, it's going to be common, but for those of you who don't know, he had this thesis, and it's basically been like taken hook and sinker in Western academia and Eurocentric circles, and even nowadays, people still repeat it ad nauseum. If you look around the internet enough, you'll see it coming up. But if you look at modern scholarship, most of it debunks a lot of his claims. It debunks his timing, that this is even the oldest text. We have really no clue when this text was written now, and it's likely a bit older than what he's written. But more importantly is this idea that it was a copied text, because I've read his entire text. I've graphed it out to show, because he gives detailed footnotes about what's in the Sanskrit text and what's in the Hellenistic sources, what is common between the two cultures. And if you look line by line, I mean, it's I haven't come up with the exact calculation, but probably 80% or so of it is nowhere in the Hellenistic stories. Sources. The vast majority of Yavana Jataka is only in Sanskrit sources, according to this author himself. Okay. So, and he can't even identify an original Greek text. He says it must have been lost, and this the weakest argument, because you can say, oh, well, there's this Indian text is lost. There's thousands of rotting palm leaves throughout India which contains who knows what type of knowledge. And then there's also, I'm sure there's plenty of texts that are hidden, not even shared openly. So, we don't even know what we're missing in India yet. So, this idea that it's a lost text is completely weak and actually invalidates it even further. But there's a lot of very Indian specific knowledge too within the Yavana Jataka that's couldn't have been copied. Okay, and so and if anything, it shows in his own source notes too. There's very fragmented approaches to the knowledge in the Hellenistic sources, but with the Indian sources, you see that similar ideas crop up across texts, and while there are some variations and principles here and there, it's a much more solid. It just suggests more continuity and a more solid tradition. Okay, so this concept that astrology was brought from the Greeks makes no sense. If anything, yes, it may have Babylon, the Persia, those areas may have influenced, and they probably were exchanging ideas, but not likely from the Greeks, who, didn't even have Horus Copy until Alexander came. Okay, so bad thesis. And, there are other things where, the meaning of Yavana, people think it was, it meant Greeks, but really, it could have referenced this area, Bactria, and up, modern day Iran, that kind of area, people coming from there, which is roughly there where Varaha Mahira came from, so there's a lot of connections here with that region, and it's not necessarily a Greek text. We also see that a lot of modern scholarship is starting to show too that there was an influence of Eastern thought into Greek worlds. Actually, there's like, even for example, the concept of the elements and it follows this similar pattern. And you'll see it if you do cross textual analysis ever. But there's always generally a more stable pattern, or more logical development of these ideas within the Indian tradition, suggesting it was passed down or developed within those texts. But then when you look at how these similar ideas play out in the Greek text, they're often much more fragmented. There's more loose application. It calls a lot into question, and I'm not saying it proves anything, but it's an interesting thing to study further. And then, when we talk about like zodiac signs as well and their development, in the ancient, the ancient Indians were using, 12 forms of signs and whatnot in different, possibly in different forms as well. If we look at like the Vedic, the adityas, the 12 adityas, those associations are, you can map them along with the signs very closely, and that is a possible precursor or Indians' own version of how science developed. And the truth is, we don't really know how the science developed, even within the Babylonian reality. We don't know. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. Where they came from, it's very hard to piece this knowledge together. So these origin claims, we have to get over this big time, like Indian and otherwise. Okay, so we know it came from an old source. We know these cultures interacted and shared all sorts of knowledge. That's kind of the basic thing we can go to. Now, the next argument I want to look at, and the last one I want to cover here, is that other texts mention the tropical zodiac. And the key thing I think here to realize is yes, you're going to see this, but a lot of these texts were starting to be written down, when the two zodiacs aligned. And one of the big writers I'd like to give reference to here is, for example, Varahamihira. And someone like Ernst Wilhelm even quotes him, trying to show that his texts show a confusion between sidereal and tropical. But if you look at the actual quotes given for what he's saying, is Varahamihira references, now he says, the zodiac, now, the equinox now starts, from Cancer and Capricorn and so forth. However, it used to start from someplace totally different. So he's referencing, yes, they're aligning right now. And he goes on to conflate, saying, the Rashis and the Nakshatra Patars go together, right? And so that's an astrological text that shows that. And then if we have, Parashara, once again, we have this reality. And so I don't have a solid answer for, some of these texts, why they're, coming. Perhaps that's how the text stayed. Perhaps, yes, it was inserted. Perhaps there was some confusion. I can't give a strong argument for or against, but it's pretty clear that the Nakshatra Padas are aligning with whatever zodiac you're using, and that Sidereal is being used in this text from the source we have. So, just keep that in mind. Another big argument that comes when people start saying, "Oh, the zodiac has to be tropical," is that a big one I've heard is, the equinoxes and the solstices mark turning points, and those are chara rashis. Those are the movable signs, which would, that's only the tropical zodiac can explain that that quality of the signs, and that's just not true at all. A lot of these things are probably based more in more subtle, higher realities that have more to do with geometry and math and numerology. So, for example, if we take a circle and we put a cross in the middle of it, it defines 4 points easily, and those can be 4 starting points. It does not have to just be, the seasons and when things are moving. If sometimes people place, one explanation I've seen, you can graft these similar ideas onto the fingers, 4 fingers minus the thumb, and chara rashis can be placed right at the base of each finger because that's where it's movable, and then the fixed signs are in the middle of the finger because it can't go anywhere, and dual signs are right at the end because they move around. So like this, you can take these concepts and apply them into a multitude of different contexts. Okay, and so even though yes, the seasons, and the equinoxes and the solstices, yes, they have that quality to them, and the shifts and the changes that happen, but that's a template. Okay, that's just a template. And so all if you understand astrology, you understand that, these are archetypes we're working with, and they do represent themselves in different contexts within physical reality. But that's just one application of those ideas. There can be more. Okay, so I think that's a key thing to realize. And another key thing to realize is that there's many other designations of the Rashi that have nothing to do with the seasons at all. For example, the guna, or the elements. Like, if you actually look, and I have another video on this, how the nakshatra padas line up with the signs and the element of the signs. Unless the nakshatra padas line up perfectly, it doesn't make sense with how the distribution of the elements go within the signs. And like, that's one pattern that gives some reference to how the signs may be getting their element, for example. I haven't had a good explanation how that's a seasonal base. The Lord, all sorts of things. Okay, so not everything in a Rashi is like that. And likewise too, some of these designations, they go between both of them. So body parts get associated with nakshatras as well as Rashis. Okay. These analogies, they're not exclusive to one or the other. And the last point too is that, as I mentioned before, sign names, where this is coming from is from sidereal sources. So it begs a lot of questions. So anyways, I hope to wrap this up now. But basically, I want you to think, and really think. Basically, if you don't accept that Parashara uses sidereal astrology, then you really have to call into questions any of the conclusions that you might make from ancient literature to back up your own claims, okay? Yes, everything can be debated. Yes, some texts, we have stronger arguments for in certain areas, but, basically, if you're going to deny that sidereal is being used in Parashara, then you're going to have to come up with a lot more evidence. Another thing people say is that, you need just test it. We have to test we can't take anything at face. They'll agree with that and say, yes, we can't take anything at face value, and we have to test everything. And I find this somewhat of a ludicrous statement. Yes, research, testing, to support that, but you can't really test everything. There has to be some, baseline understanding that you have to come with. And also, each system, I don't deny that, like, people are getting results with some of these other approaches, maybe, and, even like modern Western tropical astrology. Yes, they're getting results in specific areas. But if you look, people use rules very differently for different things and come up with their own kind of approach. And so, I'm not going to deny that your thing works, but it's new. If you you have to look at, like, how old are these principles? How well developed is the knowledge coming out of? What who are the practitioners using it? Lots of different questions you want to look at, but I don't buy this idea about just testing everything and everything's math and it can be proven perfectly. I haven't seen anybody who professes these kind of things to come up with anything solid or prove anything otherwise. And I've interacted with a lot of people around this topic, and quite frankly, I'm not impressed with people who are using the Tropical Zodiac with Jyotish calculations. I haven't seen much depth or any proof that they have solid, repeatable principles to make predictions with whatsoever. And trust me, I've tried. I'm really interested in this topic. And, like you, when I first started studying, I came across this pretty quickly, and it made me question. And I was looking at the arguments, and it's like, that maybe they're onto something, And it's very easy, especially in the internet world, to get caught up in that. And then there's just so much information that's put out around it that it's you start going with it. And if you don't, have something to bump it off of, it's, you might roll with it for a while. But anyways, one later thing too is that if Parashara is the foundational Bible of all these later schools and principles, yes, some of this confusion, especially with the Tropical Zodiac and Sidereal, it's probably the later schools that are confused more than the more ancient sources, because according to most sources, we're in the Kali Yuga, and there is a confusion coming down the road. I understand there's even arguments and confusions if we're in the Kali Yuga, but made videos on this too. I'm not going to get into it, but either way, that's another thing to think about. And this last point, or this next point, it's not the strongest point, but it's just something to think about, is if the Ayana Bala does suggest the planet's strength based on, seasonal and tropical placements, if Parashara did use tropical, throughout the rest of the text, the strength would almost kind of be a redundant calculation in some ways. So, something to ponder. You might be able to make an argument otherwise, and, I'd be interested to hear it, but something to think about. And lastly, where's the research? A lot of people, once again, claiming tropical works so much better with sidereal placements. Like I said, I've gotten in discussions with a lot of people using this, and usually a lot of times I've been able to show them things pretty quickly with what I'm doing, and it's just fallen apart with what they're doing, and I just haven't been impressed with the level of conversation when it actually comes to, like, applying it to charts. Nor have I seen any side-by-side research. So, like, I went to all the trouble of making, like, some videos to create some more discussion around it, to show a principle being worked across many charts with both systems, and I've yet to see something likewise coming from anywhere else. So I'm really I am curious in this topic, and I'm just not seeing the research. So nonetheless, that's all I want to talk about this topic ever. Maybe it's kind of a tiresome topic, since there is so much more to learn and so much more to do with the actual charts. But I hope this has been interesting and useful, and at least getting some people who are kind of on the edge out there about some of these questions, some of these arguments, just a little more to think about, a little more to question. And, I would love for someone to come up with more solid responses, but I just don't see any reason to deny that Parashara is using Sidereal Zodiac here. So, yeah, thanks for listening, and I hope you're well. Take care.